digital banks and digital brands that have come into the financial side have taken a lot of learnings from some of those best in class, just straight up tech brands to create experiences that make it really easy, that make it so you can see your full financial picture.
As $84 trillion transitions from baby boomers to Gen Z and Millennials by 2045, financial brands face a critical shift. Younger generations are leaving traditional institutions for digital-first experiences and personalized solutions. This evolution demands that brands build authentic connections and trust, focusing on values that resonate with new investors. Today, we welcome Brand Strategy Director at Design Bridge and Partners. She has over 15 years of experience in brand strategy and campaigns and is passionate about understanding consumer emotions. As we dive into the future of branding, let's welcome Rachel Darivoff. Folks, please keep in mind that all of Rachel's info, social media, and resources will be in the show notes. Rachel, welcome to the show. What is the Great Wealth Transfer and what misconceptions exist about it?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. The Great Wealth Transfer is, as you said, this idea that the 84 trillion that currently exists within the realm of baby boomers and the silent generation will eventually pass the financial baton, or whatever is left of it, to Gen X, Millennials, and Gen Z. And so that in a nutshell is what the Great Wealth Transfer is. And you also asked about the misconceptions about it. And I would say one is that the first misconception is probably that it will be great. It's hard to know exactly how much of that 84 trillion that people are measuring today is actually going to be left when the Great Wealth Transfer happens. In addition, the Great Wealth Transfer is not a one-time immediate thing. It's going to happen over the next couple decades, maybe even the next 30 years. So the impact of it is not something that's going to be seen or felt immediately. And as mentioned previously, we don't know exactly how much of that impact is actually going to be felt. There's increased costs of living, there's increased costs of medicine, and even if people do own their homes outright, costs are high and rising. And the idea of wanting to maintain your lifestyle as you get older really starts to add up in terms of dollars. So there's a possibility that people will actually spend a lot of what they have just trying to make it through their final years.
With this gradual shift then, how are consumers today building wealth? Because it sounds like they really can't rely on that inheritance that may or may not happen over time.
Yeah, and I think the fact that the inheritance itself is a lot of it's limited to people who are already wealthy. So what we see that's really interesting these days is the way consumers are building wealth has blossomed because of the democratization of different platforms and wealth building opportunities. So when we look at Gen Z and millennials today, they've been able to diversify the way in which they've built their wealth. So you see that at like the ripe age of 19, I definitely was not investing by then, but Gen Z are investing earlier than any other generation has before. They're juggling Robinhood, Coinbase, Fidelity, and of course, then have all their cash in their cash apps and Venmos and even sitting around in the Starbucks app. So they are figuring out different ways in order to manage their wealth and to make money because they don't trust the old ways of managing and making money because that's in their minds, especially in this highly stratified world that we've been living in, they see that as not something that's available to them and not something that's going to be fruitful for them. So I think there's a statistic, something like 80% are seeking alternate opportunities or alternative investments. And that is beyond sort of your Robinhoods, your Coinbases. That could include real estate. That could include private equity and emerging asset classes, which could be something like sneakers or art. So that is how a lot of people today in the younger generations are starting to try to build wealth. I think 55% or something like that of Gen Z own crypto, which if you think about it compared to the rest of the population is a pretty large amount. Yeah.
So, okay, let's kind of dig into those consumers of today then. How are they acting differently, behaving differently, or maybe it's just how they value things differently compared to past generations.
Absolutely. So I think the behaving differently in terms of their milestones and what they're actually working towards is something that we're seeing, at least in the brand space, is starting to really impact the way that brands need to think and act. So when we think about in the traditional FinServe financial technology world, you think of a mortgage, having a baby, and those are the images and the conversations through messaging and media that a lot of more legacy brands are having with consumers, forgetting the fact that the younger consumers, the ones who will be impacted by this great wealth transfer, however it ends up being, ultimately, those aren't necessarily their milestones. Those are their financial priorities. They're coming up in a time where if you're to ask a millennial, "Oh, when do you plan on buying a house?" You'll probably get a laugh. There's a whole like meme verse dedicated to memes about the joke of buying a home as a millennial. Avocado toast are not going to save us all. So ultimately, they're changing the way, especially Gen Z, are looking at what does the next step mean for me? And that could also just mean not a traditional job. We're seeing freelance gig work, artistry, the hustle, quote unquote, becoming a much bigger part of these people's lives than the traditional 401k traditional job market. So the way in which they are looking ahead and what they are looking forward towards is extremely different from anything we've seen before. And that's impacting the way that some of these startup brands are talking to them as well. You see someone like a Cash App or a Chime, they are actually creating content around the idea of the hustle. Or Chime actually is saying, okay, so you want to quote unquote buy a music video, you want to buy a gaming rig. What are the things that these young people are actually working towards? That's what's different.
So basically, the financial milestones really have changed. We didn't get there overnight. How have they evolved over time?
I think it's the nature of the overarching culture that we're living in, the fact that so much does feel out of reach. I think in every generation there tends to be a bounce back against what has come before. And I think in the volatility that has been experienced by so many, I graduated during the Great Recession, and I remember seeing so many friends coming out of university and not having a job and what that looked like and felt like for all of us. And I think while that has changed, I think there still is this feeling that has been maintained from that point in time in which people are just trying to find other ways to make ends meet and or to maximize what they're doing. So, yes, to get by in the day to day, but also to live the most that they can. And I think people are seeing as they're seeing, maybe I won't have the great wealth transfer happen for me, right?
Right.
Maybe what my parents did isn't what worked. Maybe the way that society is set up isn't actually the best way for the changing world in which we live in. And I think a lot of today's generations have responded to that in figuring out their own ways to manage wealth, develop wealth, and build a life that has different milestones in it.
I think that really ties back to what you said about people choosing what they want their life to look like, really. So, Rachel, in your line, how are brands effectively communicating, one, that they understand the shifts, but not just in consumer priorities, but also the changes in shifts in values?
Well, I think some brands are doing a pretty good job of it. And I think some are trying to, but not doing a great job.
Okay.
One brand that I think has done a really lovely job of managing the ebbs and flows is MasterCard. They actually have a series of products that are based on crypto. They developed the first crypto credit card, the first crypto credit programs, and they work with banks to develop offerings such as there's a card where you can get your rewards in crypto. There's a card where you can make all of your purchases in crypto. And I think that sort of innovation is really meeting consumers where they are today and recognizing that the world is changing and the way people pay for things is changing.
No, the world really is changing. So what would you say the factors are behind the female wealth boom, and how's that impacting the financial landscape?
I think the factors behind the female wealth boom are very much driven by the great wealth transfer. Something I think like 30 trillion of the 84 trillion is set to be handed over to people who identify as women. And I think part of that is because women tend to live longer than men. So a lot of the women receiving that wealth are not, in fact, in the millennial Gen Z range. They might also themselves be boomers and Gen X. And on top of that, the way in which women, regardless of generation, are taught to manage money is different because many of them were not. But when you look at the millennial generation as opposed to sort of the boomer generation, you see a much larger proportion of women in charge of household finances. They're the ones who are running the wallets, running the budgets, and actively knowledgeable about how their family's money is invested.
Really are driving the economy. Yeah,
Precisely. Yeah. So that's women overall are more likely to be a little bit more conservative because they're focused on more tangible goals and more tangible needs as opposed to the male population who statistically we see it with the Reddit slash Wall Street quite a lot. There's a lot of bro culture that happens there. There's a lot of ways of working with the stock market that feel like gambling happening there, similar with
absolutely.
crypto. And again, these are all generalizations, but women, for the most part, have a very different view of finances because they are working towards something more tangible for themselves to build a foundation for themselves. And if they have one for their family, and they do that through a greater focus on philanthropic investments, through investments that are more focused on social and social responsibility. And those shifts in priority are something that we're not necessarily seeing happen in the products that are meeting them.
That's so insightful. You mentioned the financial education is different between different people, and how do brands help fill that education gap regarding financial literacy among all consumers, but also specifically directly for women? How do we more empower the ones that are actually empowering the economy?
Yeah, so I think there are several brands that have stepped up to fill the gap left by everybody else. Dow Jeans is one of them. Elvest, Alinea is one of the newer brands that we've seen come up, and these are brands that were built around women and with women at the center. Because quite simply, the old school way of working didn't exist. And when you think about the names of the big players that exist today, they are all the names of from the names of men. Like you have your Goldman Sachs, your JP Morgan, right? Morgan Stanley. It's all men who founded those companies. And I think Citi now has a woman at the helm, which has been really wonderful to see, but a lot of the banks are still very much in this quote unquote boys club. And unless they are bringing in actively C-level female leadership, attempts to try and service women and say, oh, we get you, are going to fall very flat, which is why these upstarts such as Elvest and Dow Jeans have come about because they're designed with women in mind. And that allows them to be able to speak honestly and, though I don't love this word, authentically, actually to women and to meet their needs, to say, we understand you, we understand what you're actually working towards, we understand that the way you invest is different, therefore let us design a program that works for you. And I don't think necessarily women need different products. I don't think we necessarily need special programs, but what women do need is someone on the other side of the table or the other side of the screen who is just going to listen and understand and not treat everybody as the same and paint everybody with the same brush or take their own biases and bring them into account. And so I think what some of these upstart brands can bring to the table is a demonstration of what it means to have the right data and have the right knowledge about what happens when women invest. Women actually perform better in the stock market because they're not trading all the time. They tend to sit with their investments more and invest confidently in a few things that they know are going to do well. And so I think that education piece of it is not just for female investors. That education piece is for the industry. These brands being able to teach others how to properly um, meet the needs of a variety of people.
Oh, that's really good. So let's talk about the student debt crisis. Why is it especially critical today that brands take on an educational role, that same role that was traditionally held by the government?
Without getting overly political in any of this, the it's often been up to brands to fill gaps that have been left by the government. And especially when it comes to student debt, the government for many, many, many years had rather predatory practices when it came to bringing students into the financial fold. And, say, oh, all of these wonderful things about being able to go to college, not understanding what an interest rate is, not understanding when you have to pay all of that back, what that actually means for when you take a job out of college, what your take home is after you start to pay off those loans. And really, people have just spiraled into this overwhelming debt. And there are some brands who have absolutely stepped up to recognize that and meet the needs, but perhaps not as many as we would like to have seen. I think SoFi, when they were first founded, did a really, really great job of coming into that space of being a brand that was for young people and for students, and helping students refinance their debt, and really formulated a community around that, and then have continued to build themselves as a brand around that idea of what SoFi stands for, which is social finance. And so really being able to provide the content and education and elements in their digital products themselves, whether that's articles that pop up in your banking app. So it's not just your ones and zeros. It's also, oh, we realize that you invested in this. Are you also interested in an article about it? And really trying to help things come a little bit full circle there. So
It felt like a more accessible financial relationship.
yes.
Okay, so we're talking about tech first brands. We're talking a lot of more traditional financial brands. What's the key distinctions between the two?
So I would say the tech first financial brands are different, namely because they are built tech first. And there was actually a statistic we saw recently, something like 80% of Gen Z and millennials would be open to a financial product if it was offered by Google or Apple or Meta. And when you see that, it really makes you think, well, why is that? Those aren't people who are known as experts in this space. They're not financial born companies, but they are digital born companies. And they are experts in creating holistic digital experiences. They're experts in tying together different parts of people's lives into a singular um, entity, whatever that could be, whether that's an app or a website. So you can see all the parts of your life together and creating things that feel really seamless. And I think digital banks and digital brands that have come into the financial side have taken a lot of learnings from some of those best in class, just straight up tech brands to create experiences that make it really easy, that make it so you can see your full financial picture. So you can use elements of open banking to start to understand what everything looks like across your purchasing habits and your patterns and your investments, and be able to budget on a more holistic level. And so when we think about education and when we think about that, those digital first brands really have done an excellent job of doing that, of thinking, well, what would it look like if you had a better picture? Would that make you a more savvy investor? And the answer seems to be yes. So that's been really fabulous to see. And the less successful ones have been playing a lot of catch up, often because they're built on legacy technology and because they are built through acquisition. So a lot of these big banks and big financial services companies have brought others under them in an attempt to fill gaps that they have missed. As a result, their digital products have a lot of different moving parts to them. Sometimes you have multiple apps for the same bank in order to try and get into the same place.
Oh, yeah.
And so it takes a lot of time and effort in order to try to bring those things together. And a lot of the legacy providers haven't taken the time to do sort of a full reset or a full sweep and say, you know what, let's start from the beginning, because they're so busy in trying to continue to service and continue to service and sort of putting band-aids on things rather than taking a net approach of what actually is the job to be done here.
That was so insightful for me. And it really comes down to that weighing the value of growth versus the value of building what you need in place to accommodate that growth. And
Yeah.
thanks for sharing.
Sure.
Rachel, what opportunities exist for brands to engage with consumers through educational initiatives like the webinars, the workshops, the tutorials? What are you seeing as the opportunity today for that?
I think the opportunities are going to be different depending on the brand. I think every brand needs to find ultimately what they stand for so they can stand out in the right way. So, spoke a little bit earlier about brands like Chime or Cash App, who, again, born in the digital space and very clearly directed at a specific audience, partnering with influencers and, musical artists in order to get their point across. So, for them, the types of, I think it might have been Cash App or Chime, and, this is, maybe an instance where two green brands with names that start with C in the financial space might not be differentiated enough. But one of them is partnering with Sha'Carri Richardson in order to do a series on how do you sell on Depop, right? We talk about side hustles, all of that kind of thing. And what are other ways to make money to grow your income? And I think brands like that are focusing on content like that is highly specific to their audience and extremely relevant. And that's great. But if you were to have Wells Fargo try to make the same thing, that would fall completely flat. That would be awful. They would be laughed out of the room. So when you're a legacy brand, understanding who you are and what you stand for is important, and then figuring out where that matches up with the audience that you're looking for in a way that's going to work for you. Because if you try to be something you're not, it will just continually come across as disingenuous. So that could mean that using the fact that you're legacy, the fact that you've built trust in order to break down some of the untrustworthy things that happen in this space. There's tons of scams that happen. There's a lot of misinformation on social media. So maybe if you're a legacy brand, that's the education route that you take. So finding out which is the best way in for you is, I think, always going to be the key in building brand while also helping to build a stronger financial community.
You know, Thinking about the education and filling in the gaps, how important is diversification and teaching that to consumers today? And how do brands best facilitate that learning process?
I think diversification is hugely important. And earlier we chatted about the fact that uh, Gen Z and millennials today do not believe they'll get great returns just by stocks and bonds alone. And that belief versus that reality, perhaps two different things, but it has driven the manner in which they are investing. So diversification, I think, has always been important, but the education around it hasn't always been taught. Um, in conversations with some of my friends, there are some who are on pension plans and have thought like, oh, just because I'm on a pension plan, I work for the, education department, I'm set. This is great. I have my pension plan and I have my bank account. But they never thought to invest before. And it's kind of wild being at a certain point in your life and realizing that some folks had never had access to that kind of information and are starting to invest for the very first time in their mid 30s, late 30s. So I think that sort of knowledge needs to be passed down. And the way to do it from a brand lens is, again, figuring out how to do it in a way that is going to be not seen as self-serving, but rather serving actually the end user and the consumer. And especially when it comes to legacy brands that have a number of different products and a number of different ways to get involved, doubling down on those products and services, offerings and features can become very overwhelming. And often then as a result, the consumer just gets confused and they lose sight of like, what are you actually offering me? So again, that figuring out what you stand for, that one promise you can deliver people is ultimately what's going to bring them into the fold. Then you can help them understand, okay, here's how we can help you achieve X and all of the different ways in which you can do that. And from a net new brand, not net new, but newer brand perspective, I think the key is knowing what you do well and sticking with it as opposed to trying to be everything to everybody. Robinhood, for example, has gotten a little bit into event trading and things along those lines. And I think for a platform that has had some issues in terms of people treating it like gambling because it is free to trade. Going into the realm of event trading has potential to tarnish a reputation that Robinhood has worked very hard to build of this democratized way to engage in finance and to diversify your assets and your holdings in ways that previously might not have been available for you. So I think if in everybody in this space continually checking ourselves and measuring ourselves from a brand lens as well as from a product and offering lens to really deliver ultimately what's best for the customer.
Let me ask a follow-up question. So, because you were giving some really great advice for that new brand, what advice would you give for that new brand entering the global conversation, really trying to navigate their way between traditional finance and a more accessible platform?
I think there's a lot that can be learned from the legacy brands in terms of the trust that they built over the years. Security in this space is no joke. And I think really ensuring that the right protocols are in place to give the confidence to the consumer is crucial. And I think that could mean partnering with certain legacy brands in various cases, and even perhaps using some of their products to integrate into your own to ensure that you're going to have an actual robust foundation for people to build upon. So I think that trust, security, and how that's all been communicated by legacy brands is a really important learning. I think another one potentially could be the fact that as you're going about this journey as a newer brand and trying to engage in this space, is knowing that just because you're a newer brand doesn't mean that you have to be engaging with musical artists in order to reach Gen Z. I think there are lots of different ways to establish yourself, and there are a lot of brands already playing in that space. There are a lot of brands saying, look at me, I'm really cool. Look at me, I'm really hip. Look at me, I know all the slang. So there is still space for new brands in the financial services area to be that more trusted hand to hold that feels maybe a little bit more secure.
Thank you for sharing that. Rachel, I like to end our episodes with a fun anecdote about my guests. Share a story, a fact, or an experience about yourself that our listeners would find entertaining.
Um, a fact or an anecdote. I'm a certified yoga instructor.
No kidding. Okay.
Yeah, it's been a minute since I've taught because I became a mom over the last year, and so my
Oh,
life's turned a little bit up.
congratulations.
Thank you.
Sure.
My life's turned a little bit upside down, but I am a certified yoga instructor and certified both in regular yoga as well as yoga for special populations. So I
Oh,
actually spend a lot of time working with the cancer community and teaching yoga to people living with cancer.
Rachel, thank you for being on today. This was an enlightening conversation. And a quick reminder to everybody tuning in, Rachel's info, social media, resources are included in the show notes. See you all next week. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode of Planet Wealth Fortunes of the Brave, check out our other videos for more insights and strategies to elevate your financial freedom. You can subscribe right here and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Join our community and take your financial future to the next level. I'll see you in the next video.